In 1986, the late John Hughes gave film audiences one of his most beloved teen dramedies and teen heroes. Filled with memorable scenes, zippy one-liners, and a motley cast of characters, Ferris Bueller's Day Off is a film that not only stands the test of time, but helped define a genre. But watch this classic again as an adult, and you realize that more than a few parts of the movie are actually pretty cartoonish and require a serious suspension of disbelief. Here are just a few examples. Unbelievable toys. From his totally boss stereo to his killer IBM computer and beyond, Ferris has a bedroom that would make him the envy of any 80s teen.
Hi, Ferris, how's your bod? Oh my god, you're dying?
Then there's that awesome synthesizer he uses to make convincing fart and vomit sound effects while rallying the troops at school. It's an emu emulator too, the creme de la creme of synths used by 80s bands like Depeche Mode. It would have set Ferris's parents back about $8,000, an insane price tag, considering there's no evidence Ferris even knows how to really play it or any other instrument, or that his parents are quite that well off.
Never had one lesson.
Wacky wardrobe. Ferris changes his outfit an absurd 9 times before Cameron even picks him up in the morning, pulling looks out of the ether like Bugs Bunny. All before 10 a.m., Ferris's assorted looks range from PJs to pool attire, from luau gear to hip jazz cat. Various states of undress coming to and from the shower, plus his blue suit that he plans to wear to trick Mr. Rooney into thinking he's Sloane's dad. Time travel. Early in the movie, Ferris and Cameron make their phony phone call to Ed Rooney from Ferris's house and disagree about how to handle picking up Sloane at school. To Ferris's dismay, Cameron, as Sloane's dad, blurts out that Mr. Rooney should have Sloane outside the school
in 10 minutes by herself.
This leads to a series of events that would suspiciously take longer than 10 minutes. Ferris and Cameron argue over the details, Ferris delivers an emotional apology, and the two are chums again. They then travel to Cameron's house, where Ferris convinces Cameron to borrow Cameron's dad's vintage Ferrari. They secure the vehicle and travel all the way to Shermer High, somehow arriving only a minute or so after Mr. Rooney and Sloane emerge. Identity crisis. The biggest mystery about Sloane Peterson is how seamlessly she goes from utter terror that Ferris's dad might spot her in the taxi line at the restaurant to nonchalance about making kissy faces to Mr. Bueller later from the backseat of another taxicab. Sure, she has those Ray-Ban sunglasses on as a brilliant disguise, but even perpetually oblivious Mr. Bueller must recognize his son's super serious girlfriend, right? Considering Ferris proposed to Sloane back at the stock exchange, things might get pretty awkward at the wedding. Mysterious gifts. Aside from a quick visit from Mrs. Bueller to check in on an ailing Ferris, and Ferris's sister Jeannie's time at home when she kicks Mr. Rooney in the face and huddles in her bedroom to call the police, the Bueller home is mostly empty for the day while Ferris enjoys his time off. Yet when everyone comes home at 6 p.m., the hallways are filled to the rafters with the balloon and flower deliveries sent by the entire town to wish Ferris a speedy recovery. So who accepted all those deliveries? It couldn't have been Jeannie. In fact, we see her slam the door in the singing telegram nurse's face. And it likely wasn't Mr. Rooney, because the one vase of flowers we saw him pick up ended up on the head of the family's Rottweiler. Does Ferris have a robot butler among his many fabulous toys? The late bus. Ferris Bueller's Day Off is loaded with brilliant moments and immensely quotable lines, but the fun doesn't stop when the credits roll. You've gotta love seeing the disheveled and broken Mr. Rooney accepting a warm gummy bear from his bespectacled bus seatmate, set to the unforgettably catchy strains of Yellow's Oh Yeah.
I bet you've never smelled a real school bus before.
But when you watch it again as an adult, you realize there's something peculiar about that school bus filled with teens pulling up to Mr. Rooney and asking him if he needs a ride. We know it's now long past 6 o'clock p.m., and those kids should have been home hours ago. Who are these kids? Is the driver lost? Considering everything else he managed to pull off, sticking Rooney on this bizarre bus just might be Ferris's handiwork.
It's good for him. It teaches him to deal with his fear.
Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle turned out far better than anyone had any right to expect. What initially sounded soulless and cynical ended up being a massively successful, well-received, family-friendly thrill ride for kids and adults alike. Starring Dwayne Johnson, Kevin Hart, Jack Black, and Karen Gillan, the movie effectively built on the 1995 story about a magical board game with a video game-based body swap comedy sequel. Welcome to the Jungle made a lot out of a wacky premise, but that doesn't mean it was perfect. Many of its quirks won't be picked up by younger viewers, but the adults in the room probably noticed them. Here are some of the things only grown-ups will notice in Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle. What console is that? Jumanji opens in 1996, introducing viewers to a teenage boy named Alex in a sleeveless Metallica tee whose bedroom is covered in pop culture posters from the era. Nothing says 1996 teenager like his quick dismissal of the Jumanji board game in favor of his trusty PlayStation controller. We see he's playing Twisted Metal, a game that was released for the PlayStation in November 1995. But when we pause to marvel at all the authentic 90s stuff in his room, we get a good look at the console itself. Spoiler alert, that's no PlayStation. It doesn't even remotely resemble a PlayStation. From the looks of things, its closest twin is the Atari 2600, a wood-paneled console that was already 20 years old in the mid-90s. And of course, since you've noticed it once, you're not going to be able to ignore that all the controllers go from PlayStation to vaguely Nintendo-esque when the kids pull the game out at the school. Fittingly enough, they can't make heads or tails of this odd contraption either.
What is it, like some type of old school Nintendo or something?
I don't think so. I don't recognize it.
Have your cheesecake. It seems to be a common belief that just acknowledging overdone, cliched tropes is enough to subvert them in movies or shows, but that's not really always the case. Jumanji uses Martha as a mouthpiece to criticize the unnecessarily skimpy outfit worn by her avatar, Ruby Roundhouse. But as good a sentiment as this might be, the film is making this commentary on how women are designed in video games while it simultaneously benefits from having a young actress in a skimpy outfit. Fortunately, the movie is brimming with charm and doesn't rely too heavily on sexy shots of a woman's body to keep people watching. In fact, she adds bits of her male companion's outfits to her own in order to feel a bit more comfortable as she journeys through the jungle kicking bad guy butt with her dance-fighting techniques. But the marketing for the movie has no such subtlety, making this a noticeable instance of Jumanji wanting to have its cake and eat it too. Perish the thought. At the midpoint in the film, when the teens have been set upon by corrupt researcher Russell Van Pelt, and there's no obvious way to move forward, the missing teenager Alex shows up in the avatar of Jefferson Seaplane McDonough. He leads our heroes through a hallway full of authentically video gamey traps to his little hideaway set apart from the main Jumanji playing area. He's been holed up there for who knows how long, keeping his head down and trying to hold on to his last life. He explains to the new kids that the little bungalow where he lives, drinking delicious margaritas, is not a structure of his own making. Instead, it once belonged to a man named Alan Parrish. Alan Parrish is, of course, Robin Williams' character from the original Jumanji. Not only is the reference a lovely tip of the hat to Alan's character, it also gives fans of the original movie a glimpse at how Alan was living during his years away. Alex's amazing slang.
She's pretty fly. Shoot a bomb. I'm just saying, I'm sure they'd like to get jiggy with her.
Alex's tortured 90s slang is out of place in the jungle and also this century, but his lame-o vocabulary helps the four kids realize that the Alex they've found inside the game is Alex Vreek, the boy who's been missing and stuck in Jumanji for 20 years. It's not a bad idea to use outdated slang to tip off the characters that Alex is from another era. But there are a few problems here. One is that Will Smith's Gettin' Jiggy With It came out in 1997, not 1996. Plus, exactly 0 people have ever actually used the phrase gettin' jiggy in conversation. Ever. Ask your parents. Also, if they were going to go there with that style of slang, they probably should have gone with a different characterization for Alex. Instead of a Metallica tee and a grungy hairstyle, he probably should have been wearing a cross-colors tank top and some radical prints. The walls of his bedroom should have been covered in TLC and Michael Jordan posters. Now that's 90s. Instead, his lingo comes off as forced. Everyone knows mid-90s metalheads didn't say anything was the bomb. Then again, no one really knows what they say sometimes. The empty fridge. While Kevin Hart does good work as Fridge's avatar, the Fridge himself has no real arc and learns no valuable life lessons in the movie. Things start off promising. We learn that Fridge asked Spencer to do his homework as a favor, which turns out to be a bad idea. Spencer may be a nerd, but he's not necessarily a good student, and the bogus paper he provides for Fridge is easily sniffed out by his teacher. As a result, Fridge gets kicked off the football team. Later, when Fridge and Spencer's tension comes to a head on a cliff in Jumanji, they get into a shoving match, costing Spencer one of his lives. But by working together through the rest of the adventure, they gain a mutual respect for one another. Still, at the end of the movie, the problems that led to that cliff confrontation are still there. The boys haven't hashed out their personal conflict. Fridge doesn't apologize for using Spencer to do his homework, nor for insulting and intimidating him in Jumanji. They don't team up in the real world to get Fridge reinstated to the football team. There's no shot of Fridge working hard on his own homework, or doing anything to wrap up the problems that got him in detention in the first place. All that's changed about him at the end of his bogus journey with Spencer, Bethany, and Martha is that he seems nicer and vaguely content. The movie doesn't want you to notice it, but his academic and athletic future is still severely compromised by the movie's end. Compare him to the other characters. Bethany finally begins to take an interest in the world outside herself. Spencer gets the nerve to take a chance and kiss Martha, and Martha gets over her shy nervousness enough to kiss him back. Fridge just spent all afternoon playing video games, but all of his problems are still there. That's kind of how real life works too. The Alex Paradox. Jumanji is a family movie, so a happy ending is pretty much par for the course. But let's put on our thinking caps for a second. The implications of Alex returning to the moment of his disappearance after being trapped inside the game for 20 years should probably be more severe than the movie lets on. No, seriously, let's talk about this. If a butterfly flapping its wings in one location can have a dramatic ripple effect on everything else in the world, then a human teenager going missing would fundamentally change the fabric of at least Brantford, New Hampshire. Alex's unexplained disappearance from this small town was a major cultural touchstone for everyone who lived there. It's mentioned multiple times by different characters at the start of the film, and it's the sort of event that would have all kinds of small effects on people's relationships and behavior. Parents probably have his disappearance in the back of their minds while they're raising their kids. Old man Vreek, who was once vigorous and full of life, has his destiny dramatically changed by the anguish from mysteriously losing his son. The disappearance leads other people in town to be more cautious over the years that follow. The ending should have been more like Back to the Future, with the tiniest changes in the past having major effects in the years that followed. But nope. That never happened. Even after the timeline where Spencer, Fridge, Martha, and Bethany were living in gets winked out of existence and replaced by this new world where Alex never went missing, everything outside of Alex's family ends up being exactly the same. Beyond the confines of his household, it appears that Alex's absence from the world meant just about nothing. That's insane, right?
At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought.
Look, okay, fine, sure, we realize this is a movie about a magical video game, but that still just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, okay?
Thundercats ranks among the best cartoons of the 80s, alongside the likes of Masters of the Universe and Transformers. You may not have noticed at the time, but Thundercats has some truly unusual touches that read very differently to adult eyes. Thundercats is a bit of a sweeping epic, and it all begins with an oft-forgotten origin story. The Thundercats have to leave their doomed home planet of Thundera, and at the time, Lion-O is just a young boy. They're also mostly underdressed, by the way, but that changes quickly. Because of a long journey ahead of them, the cats have to spend time in suspended animation on the way to their new home. When they arrive on Third Earth, young Lion-O finds that his body has grown into that of a muscular adult man, but his mind is the same.
Why, I'm grown!
Even though the original team includes 3 actual adults, Lion-O is still the team leader because he's the hereditary Lord of the Thundercats. Early on, Lion-O's immaturity and naivety is a story point, but before long, that aspect mostly falls by the wayside. There are plenty of moments when Lion-O's behavior makes more sense when you remember that he's just an enormous kid, but it's almost never made explicit after that first episode.
A fine figure of a Thundercat you've grown up to be, Lion-O.
And so handsome, too.
As Thundera falls apart during the show's premiere, the central Thundercats escape the destruction under the leadership of their wise old leader, Jagger. Jagger doesn't live to see their new home on Third Earth, but he frequently returns as a shimmering blue ghost. No specific explanation for the destruction of Thundera is given in that first episode. It's only much later in the third season episode Thundercats that we learn the reason for the entire planet falling apart, and it's all Jagger's fault.
Come join me for a history lesson.
Years earlier, when Jagger was a much younger man-cat, he'd defeated a mutant leader named Rattilla, who had carried a double-bladed magical weapon, the Sword of Plunder, which is basically the evil equivalent to the Thundercats' own Sword of Omens. Upon defeating Rattilla, Jagger threw the Sword of Plunder into a volcanic canyon in order to destroy it. However, he underestimated the sword's evil magic, and the Sword of Plunder works its way to the core of Thundera, splitting the planet apart. Surprisingly, little is made of the fact that the wise advisor who has guided the Thundercats all this time actually made the mistake that cost them everything. Thundercats largely takes place on a planet called Third Earth, but that can't possibly be our Earth, right? It just looks too weird. We live on First Earth, or as we call it, Earth. The third one must be out in space somewhere. However, if you pay attention, the show makes clear that third is a matter of time, not space. This is Earth in its third age, when humans are no longer the dominant species, and many of the planet's inhabitants are alien colonists and refugees from across the cosmos. The fact is made especially clear in the episode Excalibur, when Merlin makes a guest appearance and reveals that the King Arthur stories took place on the same planet where the Thundercats now live. Merlin isn't the only ancient immortal who survived from First Earth to Third. The show's main villain, Mum-Ra, falls into the same category. With his glowing red eyes, deathly grey pallor, and twisted face, Mum-Ra is terrifying as 80s cartoon villains go, which is all the more reason that it's not entirely obvious that he's the only human being in the main cast of Thundercats. At least, Mum-Ra used to be a human being. He's an ancient Egyptian sorcerer who was granted immortality by his gods, who he calls the ancient spirits of evil. Egyptian history is avoided on Thundercats, but it's hard to miss that Mum-Ra is a mummy who lives in a pyramid, and the ancient spirits of evil have human bodies and animal heads. Just like many gods of Egyptian mythology, Mum-Ra's name is a portmanteau of mummy, and the Egyptian sun god Ra. So, while the Thundercats arrived from Thundera, and the mutants come from the planet Plunder, and even the Burbils arrived on Third Earth in a spaceship, Mum-Ra has been here all along. Of all the Thundercats characters, he's the one with whom we share DNA, and he's not completely wrong about being upset at the invasion of his planet. Early on, the powers of the Thundercats' mystical Sword of Omens seems pretty clear. It magically extends from dagger length into a full sword. It casts a big red cat signal into the sky to summon the other Thundercats. It shoots energy beams, and it allows Lion-O to see across great distances.
Sight beyond sight.
As the series goes on, however, the Sword of Omens has whatever powers it needs to have to resolve a particular plot. It can project both fire and ice at various moments, can project solid objects like walls and bridges, it flies, and even allows its bearer to fly, whenever that's convenient. It even prevents the Thundercats' home planet from exploding for a second time. A magical sword with many uses is fine, but as an adult viewer, it's pretty clear that the writers would just give the Sword of Omens a new power anytime they wrote themselves into a corner.
Think I'm funny, do you, Snarf?
For most of the series, Snarf is just another in a long line of annoying little squeaky voiced characters who don't fit in their shows, a lineage stretching from Scrappy-Doo to Orko to Screech. But Snarf once had a very specific job, acting as Lion-O's nanny.
Just let the boy come down with a fever, or the pip, or something, and who gets the blame? Poor old Snarf, that's who.
When Lion-O was a kid, Snarf was employed to watch over him and keep him safe. Once he has an adult body, Lion-O tells Snarf he doesn't need that anymore, even though he's become even more prone to getting into trouble than ever before. And Snarf's entire existence is pretty much rendered pointless. Snarf is a chronic warrior, which makes him suited to babysitting. But when he doesn't have that job anymore, the same quality is what makes him incredibly annoying.
With 2017's Thor Ragnarok, director Taika Waititi gave us something completely different from the previous two Thor films, showing us places and characters unlike anything else in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The fantastic visuals and rapid-fire jokes were enough to dazzle movie fans of any age. But while kids might be satisfied with spectacle, once older viewers really start thinking about the movie, there are more questions than answers, especially once you factor in the events of Avengers: Infinity War. Here's a spoiler-filled look at some Thor Ragnarok details that only adults notice. Odin stinks at hiding things. The key villain for most of Ragnarok is Hela, the goddess of death, who also happens to be Thor and Loki's older sister and the oldest child of Odin. Hela, it turns out, was banished by Odin, hidden away in a secret prison until his death abruptly frees her. Suddenly, the secret ain't so secret, which is actually a recurring problem for Odin throughout the Thor franchise, as the All-Father is apparently really bad at hiding things. In the first film, it was the secret of Loki's frost giant birth. In the second, it turns out there was a secret portal out of Asgard. Now, here comes a daughter that he apparently never told his sons about. And in all three cases, once the secret got out, people got killed. If Odin were a little better at hiding these things, Asgard might still exist today. Where is Sif? Both of Thor's leading ladies from the previous films are suddenly and mysteriously missing in Thor Ragnarok. Jane Foster's absence is explained with a single throwaway line saying she and Thor broke up. That's a pretty casual dismissal for a star as big as Natalie Portman, but it's nothing compared to what Jamie Alexander's Lady Sif gets, which is, in fact, literally nothing. Aside from an actress playing her in the drama Loki stages commemorating his own death, Sif isn't even mentioned in Ragnarok. In the real world, Alexander apparently had a scheduling conflict, but in Ragnarok, she just vanishes and nobody really seems to give a crap. Marvel later piled on even more, with Avengers Infinity War directors Joe and Anthony Russo revealing she died off-screen in Infinity War. Seriously, guys? Who is on Doctor Strange's watch list? Though the film spends less time on Earth than either previous Thor adventure, Ragnarok does depict Thor and Loki's unexpected encounter with Doctor Strange, who traps Loki in a pocket dimension while he has a chat with Thor about why they've come to Earth.
I keep a watch list of individuals and beings from other realms that may be a threat to this world. Your adopted brother Loki is one of those beings.
It's a fun scene, but it makes you wonder, who else is on that watch list? Is Doctor Strange the Marvel equivalent of the TSA? We have a feeling we haven't seen the last of this mysterious watch list of his. Thor, god of nothing? In addition to extreme strength, durability, and a lifespan much longer than that of a human, Thor is the god of thunder, which is a key plot point in Ragnarok.
Are you Thor, the god of hammers? That hammer was to help you control your power, to focus it. It's never your source of strength.
So if his body is naturally gifted with the power to channel lightning, why is he so vulnerable to shocks? He gets shocked by a net thrown on him by scavengers when he first arrives on Sakaar, and then is repeatedly zapped by the neck implant placed on him by Valkyrie after she captures him. Maybe those don't run on normal electricity or something, but it's weird to see him get shocked in one scene and then pull a lightning storm out of the sky in another. Valkyrie has a drinking problem. The first time we meet Valkyrie, she falls off her ship after taking a big drink. The moment is played for laughs, as are other moments involving Valkyrie and alcohol, but as the story plays out, we find she is using alcohol to block traumatic memories of her friends being slaughtered by Hela. Though her addiction is mostly played for laughs, when viewed as a whole, Ragnarok actually presents a tragic view of a woman trying to drink herself into oblivion. Where is Asgard exactly? In the first Thor film, the Bifrost is the only way to get to and from Asgard, which is why it's such a tragedy when it's destroyed. In the second movie, though, we learn there are actually secret portals that sometimes allow travel to and from Asgard as well. Okay, fine. In Ragnarok, though, all bets are off, as people seem to be able to come and go at will, simply flying spaceships to and from Asgard. Apparently, the rules for traveling to Asgard work however the plot needs them to at any given moment, as seemingly anyone can just drive there if they want. So, road trip anyone? Infinity what now? Speaking of all those Asgardians on that spaceship, Avengers Infinity War begins shortly after Ragnarok left off, with the Asgardian refugee ship destroyed by Thanos. In the carnage, we see the loss of numerous Asgardians, but we don't know anything about what happened to Valkyrie or Korg. In a Q&A at an Iowa high school of all places, though, Infinity War co-director Joe Russo revealed that Valkyrie survived, along with half the Asgardians. So where are they? Well, one clue might be hiding in plain sight at the end of Ragnarok, as the Grandmaster's pleasure cruise vessel, battered but still recognizable, can be seen parked on top of the larger refugee ship. It's not big enough to hold everyone, but Valkyrie could certainly fit, and maybe even have room to bring Korg with her. Here's hoping.
With sci-fi adventure and a cast of cosmic misfits that includes a talking raccoon and his best friend, a tree, it's no surprise that Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy was a big hit for kids when it hit theaters. All the adults who saw it, however, might have noticed a few other things that flew right over the younger viewers' heads. Destination Earth. Even though he was taken from Earth as a child and raised among the outlaws known as the Ravagers, one of the key components of Peter Quill's character is his intense connection to his homeworld. It's exemplified through the awesome mixed cassette tape given to him by his mother before she died, which he listens to non-stop to form the film's soundtrack. When we see Peter as an adult, it's been 26 years since he was abducted into space by the Ravagers, and he's still holding on to the mixtape, his backpack, a troll doll, and the few other mementos he has of his old home. He's also a capable pilot who knows his way around the galaxy and even has his own spaceship named after the decidedly Earth-based celebrity Alyssa Milano. So he definitely tried to go back to Earth at some point, right? Maybe not recently, since he seems to have settled into the life of a spacefaring outlaw, but it's hard to imagine a universe in which Star-Lord didn't run away from the Ravagers and head back home at the first chance he got, even if it was just to see if the Jackson 5 ever put out another song. Unfortunately, that's not a story we've ever seen, unless he spent a few years undercover in Pawnee, Indiana.
There's only one man for the job, Burt Macklin.
Tale of the Tape. Peter's trusty Walkman and the mixtape contained within it are more than just a playlist. It's his main attachment to the memory of his mother, and it became the essential hallmark of the film, too. It's embedded in the very fabric of the Guardians of the Galaxy franchise. So much so that when he has to escape from space prison, Peter risks his life and his freedom just to get the tape back. And it also represents a genuine miracle in audio preservation technology. As anyone who was actually around in the 80s knows, cassette tapes aren't exactly the most durable format, especially if you're playing them over and over for, say, 26 years. And yet, Peter's mixtape and the Walkman he uses to play it are in perfect working condition after being bounced around the universe for a quarter of a century. And that's not the only tape tech Peter has. Either Sony has a repair tech in nowhere, or Peter just happened to run into the only member of the Nova Corps who could hook him up with a tape deck pulled straight out of the dashboard of a custom van. Zero G. When the team is taken to the Kiln prison, it's up to Rocket to come up with a way to get out. And what he comes up with actually ends up working pretty well. The escape plan hinges on the team getting up into the guard tower, turning off the artificial gravity in the prison, and then simply flying away. It's a good idea, but it also involves at least one very large chunk of luck. For some reason, when the artificial gravity goes off, the Kiln guards, many of whom had previously been holding riot shields and rocket launchers, just start madly flailing around as they float. Not only do they never recover as the Guardians make their escape, they also drop their weapons. Obviously, suddenly losing gravity would have an element of surprise, but if you're going to build a super secure prison in the depths of space, you'd think training your guards to fight in Zero G would be one of the first things you'd do. The second thing? Telling them not to drop their guns at the first sign of trouble. The Ravager Diet. Peter is abducted from Earth as a boy by the Ravagers, a group of outlaws with their own code and system of command who were hired by Peter's still mysterious father to bring him back. Yondu, the leader of this particular faction of Ravagers, decides to keep Peter and raise him like a murderous outer space Mary Poppins.
I'm Mary Poppins, y'all!
Rather than dosing his medicine with a spoonful of sugar, though, Yondu keeps young Peter in line by reminding him that he saved him more than once from being eaten by his fellow Ravagers. They seem pretty eager to find out what creatures from this distant planet called Earth taste like.
When I picked you up on Terra, these boys of mine wanted to eat you.
Yeah?
They ain't never tasted any Terran before. I stopped them.
So are Ravagers space cannibals, or do they just consider human beings to be livestock? They're made up of all manner of alien species, so if they were that willing to drop a clearly sentient Peter Quill onto their plates at lunchtime, have they also eaten members of each other's species too? That could make for some pretty awkward conversation around the table, but the movie never bothers to answer this question, even though we're hungry for answers. Love and the Single Alien. Star-Lord definitely fits into the lovable scoundrel category, and apparently that includes all definitions of lovable. He apparently has a tendency toward meaningless flings with all manner of alien species. He has a woman, whose name he's forgotten, in his ship when we first meet him. He hits on Gamora when he sees her, and later he tells Drax various stories about alien women who've attacked him after he romanced his way out of and into plenty of trouble. If you've ever watched Star Trek and seen Captain Kirk's attitude towards the Prime Directive when it comes to green women, You already know this isn't exactly a new element for sci-fi. Still, we have to ask, do all humanoid-looking aliens have compatible reproductive organs? The only elaboration we get from Peter is a story about flirting with a woman who had tentacles and needles for teeth. He says he only spent time with her in a quest for information, but what would have happened if he'd taken that interaction to the next level? Maybe we're better off not knowing. Lazy, lazy Thanos. After Avengers Infinity War, we all know Thanos is a supervillain who could be not just a mastermind, but a punishing and relentless force. Before Infinity War, though, his major abilities seem less built around fist-fighting gods and more about delegating tasks to lesser villains. This is especially evident in Guardians of the Galaxy. As he did in the Avengers, Thanos sends someone else, Ronan the Accuser, to obtain an Infinity Stone for him. Rather than doing anything himself, he spends all of his time seated on a floating throne in space, hurling threats and giving orders, but never actually showing the audience why he's so dangerous. It definitely works in the context of the larger MCU, but if you were to watch this film on its own, you'd essentially just be taking everyone at their word that Thanos is a bad dude. Here, he's basically a guy who tells everyone else to go do something for him while he kicks back and gets irritated when they fail. No wonder Ronan decided to strike out on his own when he realized he had an Infinity Stone in his possession. Mint condition. When the Guardians realize they need to get rid of the orb before it falls into the wrong hands, Gamora's plan is to sell it to the Collector, an ancient and powerful being who, well, collects things. If they give it to him, she reasons, they can both no longer be responsible for it and get paid. The Collector is happy to oblige, but while the group is in his home, he notices something else he'd like to buy. Groot.
You must allow me to pay you now so that I may own your carcass. At the moment of your death, of course.
While it's certainly nice of him to pay up front and wait for Groot to live a full life, the film also makes it pretty clear that the Collector has no such scruples about other specimens in his collection. Numerous living, seemingly sentient things are visible in his display cases, including Marvel's own Cosmo the Space Dog and Howard the Duck. Here's hoping they were offered a better deal than the one Groot was going to get. You know how to whistle, don't you? Of all the interesting space technology on display in Guardians of the Galaxy, there's nothing more intriguing than Yondu's Yaka arrow. Lifted straight from the comic page, the incredible sharp and fast weapon is controlled through whistling and a technological fin on Yondu's head, and it's powerful enough to slaughter a whole group of enemies with a simple melody. It's a neat piece of gear, and while it's certainly very effective in its current form, it's hard to watch the Yaka arrow in action and wonder why Yondu isn't thinking bigger. Sure, the arrow is elegant, but what about a rocket launcher that works the same way, or a drone, or a whole ship? Perhaps it requires more mental energy and control than Yondu's whistle can summon, or maybe it's just limited by being in range of the whistle's sound, meaning that he couldn't fly the arrow through the silent depths of space, but it seems like they might be shooting pretty low, even though it's remarkably effective.
Because of its grown-up characters, themes, and complex mythology, 1999's The Mummy provides plenty of moments that adults will be thinking about long after the kids in the room have moved on to the next thing. In the film's prologue, the Medjai warrior Ardith Bey explains that Anck-su-namun was the pharaoh's mistress, and it was forbidden for any other man to touch her. To make this point, Anck-su-namun wore very little clothes, and was instead covered in an elaborate body paint design that ran over most of her body. When her secret lover, the high priest Imhotep, touched her in a moment of passion, he smeared the paint. It's that smudge that reveals her betrayal to the pharaoh. The smudged body paint is a clever shorthand that lets the audience in on the moment without over-explaining it. But any adult who's ever put on makeup, body paint, or even a Halloween costume has to wonder why that's the look the pharaoh settled on. It certainly let him know that someone touched his mistress, but it seems like Anck-su-namun could have just as easily smeared the paint by bumping into a wall or laying down for a nap. Plus, waking up and applying all of that paint every day must have been the worst morning routine ever. No wonder Anck-su-namun went looking for another man. After the murder of the pharaoh and Anck-su-namun's death, Imhotep launched a plan to resurrect his beloved that involved a forbidden ritual at Hamunaptra, the city of the dead.
Imhotep dared the god's anger by going deep into the city, where he took the black book of the dead from its holy resting place.
Unfortunately, the pharaoh's bodyguards followed Imhotep, captured him, and subjected him to the Hamdai, a curse so cruel that the Egyptians had never performed it before. After being mummified alive and entombed in a sarcophagus filled with scarab beetles, cursed to remain the undead for all of eternity, Imhotep's body was buried in Hamunaptra. Then, a group of warriors called the Magi began their millennia-long effort to watch over the city. They knew that if the high priest ever returned, he would become an all-powerful being that could destroy the world. It begs the question, why did the ancient Egyptians need to use that particular curse if it had such potentially devastating consequences? Why not just mummify him alive like they did with the rest of his priests? It makes sense that Imhotep be punished for his crimes, but this insane curse feels like an unnecessary risk. Evelyn Carnahan and her brother Jonathan are the descendants of great explorers, and their adventure begins when Jonathan unknowingly steals the map to Hamunaptra from explorer Rick O'Connell. While investigating it, Evie's boss burns a part of the map. This convinces Evie that they need Rick's guidance if they ever hope to find the lost city. She decides to spring Rick from prison with a little bit of bribery aimed at the warden.
If you cut him down, we will give you 10%.
50%.
20.
40.
30.
25!
Deal.
Once released, the small band of explorers head off in a race against a group of treasure hunters who also want to discover the hidden Egyptian city of the dead. The journey is more than a bit bumpy. After their riverboat catches fire and sinks, the gang takes to camels to make the rest of the trip. Eventually, they find themselves on a desert plain, looking at the sunrise. It's then that Rick informs the group that they have to wait for the sun to hit an exact point in the sky before the location of Hamunaptra is revealed to them. The treasure hunters have caught up to them at this point, and as the city is revealed, it becomes a race to see which group reaches their destination first. The problem here is that Rick shouldn't need the sun to show him the way to Hamunaptra. He's been there before, after all. If he knew where to stand for the sun to reveal the city, there's a good chance he could have navigated the rest of the way simply by memory. It would have removed the need for a race, but then again, the race is a pretty great set piece for the movie. Over the course of The Mummy, the film lays out an elaborate mythology for the fabled city of Hamunaptra. Though many believe it's only a myth, various scholars have done research on it, and the film establishes clearly that the city is a very real and very haunted place. In fact, the Magi have spent millennia guarding it and trying to keep it secret. Despite the fact that not everyone in the movie believes in Hamunaptra, a lot of people still seem to have a fairly easy time getting to it. A massive battle erupts amongst its ruins near the beginning of the movie, and 2 expeditions travel back to its location years later. Evie talks frequently about its layout, and Rick notes that tales of Hamunaptra are so pervasive that his military unit defied orders to march to Egypt from Libya to look for it. So while the Magi are rather reactive once people make it to Hamunaptra, maybe they should start branching out into more proactive efforts to keep legends of the city a little more tamped down. It might make their job easier. Though it draws inspiration from historical concepts like mummies and the Egyptian concept of the afterlife, and it also mentions historical figures like Seti I, The Mummy is firmly based in the world of fiction. It's a big, fun fantasy horror adventure which allows it to take a lot of liberties, even with biblical history. One of the warnings given by the Magi about the horrible fate that would befall the world should Imhotep rise from the dead is that he could bring the return of the plagues to Egypt. And sure enough, as soon as he's back, things like swarms of locusts and fountains of blood start to plague the world once more. Despite Imhotep referencing the language of the slaves when he hears Benny speaking Hebrew, there aren't any biblical references in the movie. Yet the plagues in question are specifically drawn from the book of Exodus. So, why does Imhotep get to use the plagues that God devised to torment the Egyptians? It's probably because these days, the plagues are more associated with Egypt in general, as opposed to the specific story of Moses freeing his people from the oppression of the Pharaoh. The plot of The Mummy requires some very specific events to take place for it to make sense. Some of these events rely on ancient Egyptian rituals that many of the characters must discover and then perform correctly. In fact, the climax of the movie involves Evie, Rick, and Jonathan battling the all-powerful Imhotep and relies on the recital of spells from a pair of mystical books. The Book of the Dead contains spells needed to resurrect people, and the Book of Amun-Ra contains the spells that allow someone to command the dead or render the undead mortal once again. Both of these ancient tomes are presented as extremely dangerous in the wrong hands, and they even require a special key that unlocks the books and allows them to be opened. Unfortunately, locking the books doesn't seem to prevent some characters from using them. Near the end of the film, Jonathan gets hold of the Book of Amun-Ra and manages to command a group of mummy soldiers by reading an inscription on the cover. Apparently, you don't need to understand what you're reading to make the spells work, which increases the danger posed by them. Combined with the fact that some of the spells are written right on the cover of the books, It gives the impression that the Egyptians who wrote these volumes probably should have taken a little more care before publishing, or at the very least, devised a more foolproof security system.
The Mandalorian is a hit with all ages, but chances are that only the adults in the audience will notice these nods, references, and details. From references to classic works of foreign cinema to Star Wars trivia, here are the things only adults notice in The Mandalorian. Although it takes place in a galaxy far, far away, the Star Wars franchise can be viewed as a study of spaghetti westerns and samurai movies. George Lucas has openly acknowledged the direct influence films like Akira Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress and Sergio Leone's The Man with No Name trilogy had on his space cowboy stories. Likewise, Mandalorian creator Jon Favreau has also cited the two genres and directors as major sources of inspiration for his show. He's even been quoted as saying Din Djarin is a deconstructed version of Clint Eastwood's iconic Leone character. Another major Mando inspiration is the film series Lone Wolf and Cub, sometimes known as Shogun Assassin in the US. This classic story follows a disgraced shogun's executioner forced onto the path of an assassin, who must take his young son with him. He pushes the little one around in a tricked-out baby cart. Sound familiar? Although The Mandalorian pulls heavily from the somber tones of spaghetti westerns and samurai films, it has plenty of laugh-out-loud moments too, particularly ones poking fun at the Star Wars franchise itself. These sarcastic memes are all too familiar to mature fans, who have been dismantling all the irregularities and quirks of their beloved franchise for years. One of the more memorable of these tongue-in-cheek scenes occurs in Chapter 12, The Siege, while Mando, Greef Karga, Cara Dune, and the unnamed Mithril are infiltrating an old Imperial base on Navarro. The crew encourages the Mithril to walk out on a precarious ledge over lava to access some machinery controls, to which he replies that there's no guardrail. The stark lack of safety railings on Empire ships is something Star Wars fans have been joking about since the first film was released in 1977, and was most notably mocked in a Star Wars parody episode of Family Guy, Blue Harvest.
So anyway, I says forget the dental plan, forget sick leave, I just want a railing. You know, one railing, right here.
Another hilarious moment of self-deprecation in The Mandalorian happens during the cold open of Chapter 8, which shows two stormtroopers missing repeatedly while firing at a piece of scrap within close range. The scene's playing on the age-old trope of the notoriously bad blaster aim. For a guy who never shows his face, Din Djarin is a huge chick magnet. Younger viewers may not notice, but mature audiences will pick up on the fact that, excluding Cara Dune, the few non-Mandalorian females he's crossed paths with have either been instantly attracted to him or had some sort of romantic history with him. In Chapter 4, The Sanctuary, Din crosses paths with a young widow named Omera, who seems to want the warrior to settle down with her. Bad boy Mando also seems to have broken the heart of Xi'an, a knife-throwing Twi'lek he works with in Chapter 6, The Prisoner. She threatens to use her blades against him for whatever shenanigans he pulled on her in the past. Adults will likely appreciate the sheer irony of seeing comedian Bill Burr cast in a Star Wars-related role. Longtime fans of his podcast know that the snarky Bostonian has long riffed on the franchise, as he never forged a personal connection with the original trilogy when it was released in his youth. Burr stirred up controversy within the Star Wars fandom for remarks he made in 2015, declaring that when he did finally watch the original trilogy in his mid-20s, he wasn't impressed.
I read a quote that you had, this is a while back, I think you called Star Wars a cheesy self-help book put in outer space with Muppets.
Put in outer space, yeah.
To be fair, Bill makes fun of everyone and everything equally, even his beloved sports team. Still, it may seem curious that Jon Favreau would cast a devout Star Wars hater in The Mandalorian. As it turns out, Burr claims Favreau chose him precisely for this reason, stating he thought it would be funny. Gina Carano's background makes her the ideal candidate for playing Cara Dune, the most recent addition to Star Wars' collection of fierce brunette heroines. Before she started acting, Carano was a Muay Thai fighter who launched her career as one of the first mainstream female mixed martial artists, competing back when the sport started blowing up in the 2000s. After earning an MMA record of 7 wins, 1 loss, and 0 draws, Carano transitioned into acting in 2008 with the role of Natasha Volkova in EA's real-time strategy video game Command & Conquer: Red Alert 3. Her ability to perform her own stunts and make action look realistic on screen has kept her busy with various action roles since. Yet another influence bound to be missed by younger viewers can be seen in Chapter 9, The Marshal, in which Mando travels to the frontier town of Mos Pelgo on Tatooine. seeking out other Mandalorians to aid him on his quest. Mando gets sidetracked helping the Marshal destroy a local sand-dwelling monster that has been plaguing his town, known as a greater Krayt Dragon. Krayt Dragons are initially mentioned in Star Wars A New Hope, when Obi-Wan Kenobi scares off a group of sand people attacking Luke Skywalker by imitating its eerie howl. A Krayt Dragon's bleached skeleton can also be glimpsed poking out of the Tatooine sand behind C-3PO early in the film. However, this terrifying beast's appearance in The Mandalorian references the 1990 sci-fi horror cult classic Tremors. In that movie, giant worm-like creatures called graboids lurk underground, waiting to strike their next victim when they least expect it. While innocent young minds go no further than admiring Grogu's cool powers and cuteness factor, adult minds can't help but wonder where Grogu came from. If he's not a clone, as has been implied in the show thus far, then he was spontaneously created like Anakin Skywalker. Or he was made the old-fashioned way. So far, the only other creatures encountered like Grogu in Star Wars have been Yoda and Yaddle. Could Grogu's existence explain the latter's sudden disappearance from the Jedi High Council? That all remains fan theory for now. But regardless of who sired the being formerly known as Baby Yoda, the twisted adult mind can't help but wonder how such creatures would accomplish procreation. Awkward it would be. Yes, a pleasant image it is not. Unless you know some kids with very strange and mature tastes, they likely missed a quick Mandalorian reference to the classic comedy Office Space. The film parodies all the negative aspects of toiling away at the dreaded 9-to-5 cube farm. From horrible bosses and wasting away in traffic, anyone who has ever worked a less than desirable job can relate to this movie. Office Space also makes fun of unnecessary corporate bureaucracy and paperwork, symbolized by the dreaded TPS reports in the film.
It's just we're putting new cover sheets on all the TPS reports before they go out now, so if you could go ahead and try to remember to do that from now on, that'd be great.
These reports seem to have made their way into the Star Wars universe, because Mayfeld mentions them in Chapter 15, The Believer. It's such a quick line and easy to miss.
Come on, let's go fill out those TPS reports so we can go recharge the power coil.
And you thought the Empire was evil before? Chapter 15 is loaded with Quentin Tarantino references. Mayfeld and Mando find themselves in a dangerous situation while posing as Empire personnel. When Officer Valen Hess insists they join him for a drink. They risk exposing themselves while swapping small talk, but they can't break rank by refusing Hess's offer, so they agree. The suspenseful scene is reminiscent of the hair-raisingly intense bar scene in Inglourious Bastards. Both feature characters infiltrating enemy cultures while attempting to blend in as natives, and both situations soon explode into a violent catastrophe. Mando and Mayfeld's frolic at the Empire Bar might also remind an adult viewer of a scene from Django Unchained, when Dr. Schultz gives Calvin Candy a bullet rather than a requested handshake. Just like Schultz, Mayfeld is so overcome with loathing he can't help but pull the trigger, and thus puts his companion in grave danger. Also like Candy, Hess has a thick southern accent, and a sinister yet lackadaisical demeanor. A towering villain requires an actor of serious skill. Luckily, The Mandalorian's Valen Hess is played by a highly accomplished actor adults will likely recognize, Richard Brake. Brake succeeds in making his character absolutely hateful, but then, as grown-ups know, he has a lot of experience in that department. Brake started his acting career in 1993, with a small part as a reporter in a British comedy drama TV series, Jeeves and Wooster. Since then, Brake has performed in dozens of projects and at least 30 films spanning all genres. One of his more memorable roles to date has also been one of his most brief. He was cast as a Night King in the 4th and 5th seasons of Game of Thrones.
Like many Disney movies, Avengers Endgame threads the needle between age groups, trying to offer a solid story that youngsters and adults can appreciate, but also adding enough mom-and-pop jokes to keep mom-and-pop engaged. Avengers Endgame had plenty of things that went right over kids' heads. Spoilers ahead. After the 5-year time jump early in the film, we see Captain America leading a grief counseling group meant to help people move on after Thanos' snap. With half the living creatures in the universe gone, there are a lot of issues left unresolved. All the surviving Avengers are struggling to move on after the weight of a crushing genocidal loss that's beyond alien to most kids. Adults, on the other hand, are more likely to key into what are obviously some largely unhealthy coping mechanisms for the Avengers' loss. Of them all, Tony is the closest to moving on in a healthy way, but he's done so by moving as far into the country as he can so as to never engage with the wreckage of his biggest heartbreak. He's deep in denial, to the point where he kicks the Avengers out when they try to convince him there's a chance to make things right. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that both Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame are built on father issues. You've got the ultimate abusive big dad in Thanos, who tells everyone he meets that his genocidal warpath is all for the good of the people he's killing, that he's actually being the good guy by doing the bad thing for the right reasons. Then you've got Tony Stark, who struggles with being a father figure for Peter Parker, and for whom the latter's death weighs heavily enough in Endgame to lead Tony to undertake a mission through time to bring Spider-Man back. Then there's Thor, who often struggles under the weight of his own father's expectations. Basically, a lot of the Avengers are working through their dad issues, which is crystallized in a long moment of Tony talking to his father, Howard Stark, while on a mission through time in the 1970s. Tony manages to have a pretty in-depth heart-to-heart with his old man, even though Howard has no idea that he's actually talking to his son. Tony finally gets to work through some of his feelings and admit that Howard was a pretty good dad underneath it all. It's the kind of perspective that you're not likely to get unless you're well on your way to becoming a dad yourself.
What is and always will be my greatest creation is you.
When Thor and Rocket go back to Asgard to get the Reality Stone, the God of Thunder pretty immediately gets sidetracked when he sees his mother Frigga. Thor remembers that the day they're visiting Asgard is the same day his mother dies in the past, which brings up some understandably complicated emotions for him. Frigga finds him, however, and they're able to have one last loaded conversation about family, the future, and the burden of expectations. It's the kind of perfect last conversation that many adults wish they could have had with their parents after they passed. That level of melancholic fantasy isn't common for most kids, thankfully, and the opportunity for Thor to have one last chat with his doomed mother likely put more than a few adults in the audience to tears. Real people don't have the ability to go back in time and get closure with their parents, but plenty have dreamed of the chance. While Captain America has been leading therapy sessions and Natasha has been leading superhero teams, Thor has been leading New Asgard, at least in terms of alcohol consumption. The massive amount of alcohol Thor's been drinking has given the God of Thunder a bit of a beer gut, which leads to a handful of fat jokes throughout the rest of the movie. He's clearly dealing with depression and grief, and it's led him into a destructive lifestyle that's radically changed his body. Kids may or may not recognize that Thor's newly rotund figure is a product of beer drinking, and they certainly aren't going to clue into Thor's decision to look for a way out of the emptiness of his life at the bottom of a bottle. When it comes to time travel in movies, things almost never make sense for very long. Most of the time, these movies just kind of ask you to accept the basic concept and ignore anything weird that happens later. Endgame, however, spends a lot of time calling out various misconceptions about how time travel works in the MCU. Movies get involved when Rhodey and Scott Lang list off some of their time travel favorites: Back to the Future, Hot Tub Time Machine, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, Star Trek, Quantum Leap, Time Cop, and The Terminator. Most kids aren't going to have seen more than a couple of movies on the list, and they rattle them off so quickly that even adults might have trouble keeping up. Still, even if you were quick enough to recognize the films and remember each one's specific rules regarding time travel, it doesn't matter. Hulk pretty quickly shuts Rhodey and Scott down immediately by telling them that they're all wrong. After Scott finally escapes the quantum realm thanks to a helpful rat, he has to alert a security guard to let him and his quantum realm doohickeys out of the storage space they're being held in. That security guard is played by none other than Ken Jeong, who's previously worked with the Russo brothers on the series Community.
And a 1, a 2, a chang, 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 4.
The cameo alone might be enough to mention here, but there's one more detail in that scene that's just for adults. The security guard is reading J.G. Ballard's The Terminal Beach, a collection of science fiction short stories. One of the most famous stories in The Terminal Beach is called Endgame. It doesn't bear many similarities to the film, but the shared title is certainly no coincidence. If you thought there was something vaguely familiar about Thor's hair, beard, and sunglasses, you weren't the only one. Tony Stark noticed too. For a good chunk of the film, it seems like Chris Hemsworth's Thor is taking style lessons from Jeff Bridges' The Dude of Big Lebowski fame.
I'm the dude, so that's what you call me, you know?
The R-rated cult classic from 1998 isn't a movie that most kids are going to be familiar with, but Endgame isn't content just to leave it as a visual gag. When Stark calls Thor Lebowski in passing, it takes the quick gag into meta territory. Bridges played both the Dude and also Obadiah Stane way back in Iron Man. Stane was Tony's business partner and eventually his supervillainous rival as Ironmonger. That Tony is the one to call Thor out on his resemblance to one of Bridges' less villainous roles is icing on a cake that's just for the adults in the audience. Just because it's a serious mission doesn't mean there's not a bit of room for levity. Ant-Man and Iron Man certainly take that to heart when they journey back to 2012 along with Captain America in order to get some of the Infinity Stones. Both Tony and Scott take a moment to critique the past version of Captain America's hindquarters in his Avengers-era getup. Ultimately, Scott proclaims it to be America's ass, which is hard to argue with. Later in the film, when present Cap is fighting past Cap, he takes a moment after the fight to admit that he really does have America's best butt. It's clear in just about every scene, but that rearward-looking dialogue is likely to fly right over kids' heads, albeit with some giggling that one of their favorite heroes just said a mild cuss word. Meanwhile, the adults in the audience are likely to feel a bit called out for staring. The Rise of Skywalker is filled with plot twists and references that only older fans will get, as well as some disturbing ideas that only mature viewers will notice. Children will enjoy the Skywalker saga's finale just fine, but will they pick up on these plot points? We think not. Spoilers ahead. So let's talk about the Rise of Skywalker's big secret. Rey is Palpatine's granddaughter. Surprise? Maybe not. Abrams has been hinting that he undid The Last Jedi's nobody twist for a while now, and leaks about Rey's true heritage have been circulating on the internet for months. But if Palpatine has a granddaughter, that means he has a kid. If you're old enough to know the story of the birds and the bees, you know that means old wrinkly, yellow-eyed Palpatine played a little ding-dong ping-pong with some lucky lady. He's fully operational if you catch our drift. Unfortunately, The Rise of Skywalker doesn't reveal the identity of Palpatine's lover or children, leaving the comics and novels to explain those mysteries. That's too bad, because we'd love to meet the woman who got seduced by those shapeless black robes. We bet she has some interesting stories to tell. It took 11 films, but there's finally a canonical same-sex couple on screen in a Star Wars movie. No, it's not the sequel trilogy's most dynamic couple, Finn and Poe Dameron. It's Commander Dawsey, one of the top-ranking Resistance officers, and her wife, a Resistance fighter named Roby Tice, who lock lips while the Resistance is celebrating the defeat of Palpatine. Kids probably won't even notice the moment, which is over almost as soon as it begins, but adults will certainly realize what the inclusion of a same-sex couple in a Star Wars feature film means. Over the past 4 decades, Star Wars has been remarkably conservative when it comes to depicting relationships. But most adults will also realize that it's a very small step. Simply showing 2 women kissing isn't real representation. Dawsey isn't a real character in the film. We don't know her hopes, dreams, motivations, or fears. Heck, we barely even know what she sounds like. Dawsey was a good start, but Disney and Lucasfilm still have a long way to go. Even if children are aware of Carrie Fisher's passing, they're probably not going to give too much thought to how Leia returns for The Rise of Skywalker. There's too much else going on. For those of us who grew up with Princess Leia, however, it's almost impossible not to think about Fisher's death in 2016 every time her most famous creation shows up on screen. As such, adults are probably going to notice all the tricks that J.J. Abrams and the Rise of Skywalker crew used to give Leia the send-off she deserves. As promised, Abrams used outtakes from The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi and Leia's scenes, not a digital recreation. You can tell, Leia's lines are noticeably vague. It's up to her scene partners to deliver the specifics. Given the situation, it actually works pretty well. Leia is the heart of this movie, and it's wonderful to get a chance to say goodbye. But the sleight of hand is something most adults will definitely notice. C-3PO gets The Rise of Skywalker's best lines, but one of the movie's funniest moments doesn't have any words at all. It comes at the very end of the movie. As everyone celebrates, Poe Dameron sees his old friend Zori Bliss. They lock eyes. Poe gives Zori an inviting tilt of his head. Zori shakes him off. Poe looks disappointed. The audience bursts into laughter. The subtext should go right over kids' heads, but every adult in the theater will realize that Poe was asking Zori if she wanted to get busy. They'll also know that Zori completely shut him down. Oh well, there's no harm in trying. Look, Poe just defeated an entire fleet of Star Destroyers. He won the war. Emotions are riding high. Who can blame him for calling up an ex to blow off some steam? Rey, Finn, and Poe's quest takes them to the planet Pasaana, where a festival is taking place. The party, C-3PO explains, is thrown by the Pasaana natives, the Aki-Aki, and is held once every 42 years. If you're one of the lucky youngins who grew up in an age when new Star Wars movies have been a thing, that number won't mean anything to you. If you've been following the Skywalker saga since the very beginning, you should know immediately how Abrams and his co-writer Chris Terrio landed on 42. Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, came out in 1977. Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, came out in 2019. Guess how many years apart that is?
42.
Maybe that's a clue for the future, too. Disney says that its next Star Wars film will debut in 2022, so you might as well go ahead and set aside some time in 2064 now. You'll certainly want to see how the next saga ends. The Rise of Skywalker reveals that before he joined the Resistance, Poe Dameron used to run Spice. The way the other characters react, it's not a good thing, but it doesn't sound so bad. Who doesn't add a pinch of cumin or paprika to their dishes while they cook? Even in space, food should taste good. Except that's not the kind of spice they're talking about. Just from the language used, as well as the precedent set by Frank Herbert's Dune, mature members of the audience who don't already know will quickly figure out that in Star Wars, spice is basically slang for drugs.
He who controls the spice controls the universe.
Poe Dameron wasn't helping people season their meals. He was profiting off of other people's addictions. In the Star Wars universe, the drug trade is just as vicious and exploitative as it is in real life. It's not a good thing for someone like Poe to be involved in. Of course, in his prime, the renowned scoundrel Han Solo was known to smuggle spice too. No wonder Leia likes him.
Kids love Scooby-Doo, but there's a lot of questionable aspects to the mystery series that they might not catch until after they've grown up. Here's the most suspect stuff in Scooby-Doo shows that only grown-ups pick up on. Scooby-Doo is so familiar that we all tend to overlook its central conceit. One of the main characters is a talking dog. But even more unbelievable than a Great Dane who speaks and experiences human emotions are the reactions of the people around him.
I was saving this for an emergency. This is an emergency. That's the last hamburger.
Shaggy, Fred, Velma, Daphne, and the various criminals they bust are never impressed or freaked out by Scooby. Scooby's human-like intelligence and ability to speak should probably make him a marvel of nature, science, or both. But everybody converses with Scooby like it's the most normal thing in the world. Talking dog aside, the cast of most Scooby-Doo shows is led by the same four humans of Mystery Incorporated: Fred Jones, Daphne Blake, Velma Dinkley, and Norville Shaggy Rogers. Together, this unlikely foursome travels the land in their psychedelic van, solving mysteries and debunking supernatural phenomena. That much is obvious, but what isn't clear is just how old they're all supposed to be. They'd have to be at least 16 to drive that sweet van, and making them teens would put them closer to the show's target demographic of children. Plus, the villains love to call them meddling kids, but it also seems like they must be at least in their 20s, since teenagers wouldn't likely be found living unsupervised on the open road. And speaking of the open road, why are they out on their own in the first place? Are they homeless, or possibly fleeing something ghastly? Since the show was originally produced in the late 60s and early 70s, one possibility could have even been that Fred or Shaggy was dodging the Vietnam draft, and Daphne and Velma just went along for the ride.
Zoinks! We're gonna sink! I'll fix it. Good work, Scoob.
Kids may not pick up on the canned laughter in each episode of Scooby-Doo, but adults can't help but wonder what business a laugh track has on an animated children's show. True, the laughter may help remind young viewers that despite its spooky situations, Scooby-Doo is supposed to be a light-hearted comedy. But a laugh track suggests that the show was filmed in front of a live studio audience, which isn't possible with a cartoon like Scooby-Doo. Then again, in keeping with the spirit of the show, maybe those laughs are coming from ghosts, or are part of an evil plot hatched by a corrupt amusement park owner. While kids may not pick up on some of the show's less than subtle stoner vibes, among certain adult viewers, Scooby-Doo cartoons have long been beloved due to Shaggy and Scooby's telltale habits. A children's cartoon may not ever explicitly state that its characters are marijuana enthusiasts, but the clues in Scooby-Doo are bountiful enough that the Mystery Machine doesn't exactly need a legalize it bumper sticker to make the theme clear. For example, Shaggy and Scooby can sometimes be seen emerging from a big smoke cloud. Additionally, the pair is obsessed with food, particularly junk food. It's almost as though these two giggling slackers, one of whom wears bell-bottom pants and sports unkempt hair, always have the munchies. Which begs the question, if Shaggy smokes marijuana with his dog, isn't that animal abuse? Goal number one for Shaggy and Scooby has always been to eat as much as possible, and the two frequently care more about finding their next meal than doing their job of solving mysteries. But while the duo is constantly eating, adults may notice that they actually have a few dietary restrictions. In some of Scooby-Doo's more recent episodes, Shaggy often expresses his desire for veggie sandwiches and other substitutes for typical fast food staples. This is no accident. Shaggy moved away from meat in 2002 at the request of the guy who provided his voice. Legendary disc disc jockey Casey Kasem was a noted vegan, and he wanted to use his platform as Shaggy to educate kids about the benefits of a vegetarian diet.
These aren't burgers.
We changed management last week. Now we're organic vegan.
Every episode of Scooby-Doo seems to follow a formula. The gang drives through the night, comes across a potentially haunted location, and gets down to business looking for clues. Then, although it's never a good idea to go off alone in a dangerous place, the four humans inevitably decide to split up. And if things weren't already scary enough, Fred, their self-appointed leader, always has to go and make things even creepier. Whenever the pairings are made, Fred's the one who decides who will go off with whom. Invariably, he pairs himself with Daphne, the subject of his intense romantic interest. No matter what case they're investigating, Fred never fails to get Daphne alone with him in darkened rooms, under the guise of doing their jobs. What a creep! Adding a young, energetic character to revitalize a show that's getting a little long in the tooth is a well-known television tradition, and one that almost always fails miserably. On Scooby-Doo, this sort of cynical attempt to boost ratings resulted in one of the most universally loathed characters in cartoon history, Scrappy-Doo. A pint-sized version of Scooby, Scrappy was clearly supposed to be cute, but wound up just being annoying. Although he's meant to serve as a contrast to Scooby's laid-back, fraidy cat energy, Scrappy-Doo comes across as aggressive and perpetually angling for a fistfight. Not only is he a character nobody wanted or asked for, but adults may be concerned about Scrappy's excessively violent tendencies, and wonder whether he might even be a bit disturbed. Have you ever noticed that Scooby-Doo seems to take place in the bizarre world of meteorological anomalies, where it's always dark and seemingly cold? While kids may not notice that we rarely see the sunshine on the Mystery Incorporated crew, adults may question the persistent nighttime of the extended Scooby-Doo universe. Additionally, the near-omnipresent fog suggests a perpetually cool climate, as does Fred's heavy-looking shirt and Velma's choice to always wear a cozy orange turtleneck sweater. But Shaggy's always in a t-shirt, which begs the question, just what temperature is it in this world? When it began, Scooby-Doo was a silly, formulaic cartoon about a dog and some young people encountering ghosts, which always turned out to be shady business owners trying to scare people off their property. But starting in the 70s, to mix things up, writers and animators had the mystery solvers interact with various guest stars, whose real-world counterparts could be living, dead, or even fictional. For example, in one installment, Scooby and his friends meet Laurel and Hardy, the famous comedy duo. Those are actual people who lived, but both died long before the episode aired. On other occasions, the Scooby-Doo crew met Sonny and Cher, Don Knotts, Josie and the Pussycats, and Batman. The presence of some of those guest stars would suggest that the Scooby characters are real, since they interacted with actual living humans. But if some of those humans were dead, does that mean the mystery machine is unstuck from time? And is Batman real too? Fiction and real life are confusingly blurred, making the reality of Scooby-Doo a little tough to define. For young Scooby-Doo viewers, it may not be obvious that the episodes tend to follow similar trajectories, which always lead to a version of the same ending. What was thought to be a haunted building turns out to not be so haunted after all. Ghosts, goblins, spooks, and specters that scared the Mystery Incorporated crew so badly are revealed to be some combination of projections, shadows, sound effects, and masked bad guys. In other words, Scooby-Doo constantly reiterates that all of that spooky stuff isn't real, and that there is always a logical explanation for any supernatural occurrence. Most of the time, the mystery the characters solve is revealed to be the plot of a developer or landowner hoping to scare people off their land, because greed is usually the only real scary thing in the Scooby-Doo universe. Yet every time the Mystery Incorporated team heads out on a new job, they seem to completely forget this important fact, and the dozens of normal jerks they've unmasked in the past. Every episode features the gang overreacting to what they think is a ghost or monster, leading to Shaggy screaming,
"Let's get out of here!"
Then Shaggy and Scooby, and sometimes the entire gang, inevitably flee in terror. Either they have terrible memories, or their fear of ghosts is so severe that they ignore all logic, which kind of makes you wonder why they're in the supernatural detective business to begin with. Based on what happens during every single mystery they've encountered, one of them ought to walk right up to the monster or ghost the first time they see them and tear off that mask. But that thought never seems to occur to them. But of course, if the characters actually learned from their previous cases, there'd be no more show. Apart from mowing lawns and selling lemonade, most kids don't worry too much about putting cash in their pocket. Grown-ups, though, are concerned with earning a living to provide necessities like food, shelter, and clothing. So naturally, adults watching Scooby-Doo might have some questions about how business is conducted at Mystery Incorporated. At first glance, Mystery Incorporated seems to be a legitimate operation, with the Incorporated part of the name indicating that the detective firm is registered with an oversight agency and pays taxes. But despite the official sounding sounding name, adult viewers may wonder exactly how this company is able to operate. Although money rarely changes hands, business still appears to be booming, at least enough for the firm to afford a company car, or in this case, a groovy van. One wonders what sort of wage the four humans earn, and whether or not Mystery Incorporated offers health, vision, and dental benefits. In classic episodes of Scooby-Doo, the dedicated detectives of Mystery Incorporated navigate through the many back roads and country highways of America, forever in search of their next sleuthing gig. But if you look closely, that straightforward premise may have some dark undertones. In the world of Scooby-Doo, all the buildings seem to be falling apart, and the land is dotted with closed amusement parks and long-abandoned ghost towns. All of this, coupled with Shaggy's sheer relief whenever he comes across food, suggests that these young entrepreneurs are trying to get by in a world that has taken a pretty significant turn for the worse. Perhaps a severe economic depression left the country in shambles, or some kind of natural or man-made catastrophe prompted people to flee all those small towns. The show may be for kids, but all the signs seem to indicate that Scooby-Doo might be a glimpse at life in a post-apocalyptic nightmare. Anyone who's caught a few episodes of Scooby-Doo over the past 50 years probably recalls the words to its bouncy, memorable theme song. The theme song seems to imply that Scooby-Doo spends most of the show being hard to locate, and that the Mystery Incorporated team is constantly searching for him so that they can get to work. But that's not actually what the show is about at all. Scooby-Doo never disappears during the episodes, and he and Shaggy are never apart for long. Sure, Scooby may run away from scary stuff, but Shaggy is always with him, making the song's suggestion that Scooby is constantly missing a real mystery.
Disney's Sky High is a charming superhero movie about growing up, getting through high school, and saving the world. If you only ever watched it as a kid, however, you're missing a lot of the movie's best puns, details, and dynamics. These are the parts of Sky High only the grown-ups get. Sky High's protagonist, Will Stronghold, has multiple Tenacious D and the Pick of Destiny posters on his wall. This R-rated 2006 stoner comedy focuses on a pair of slackers on a quest to become the greatest band of all time. Not exactly the kind of thing the kids watching the PG-rated Sky High would tend to notice, but that's not the only interesting bit of memorabilia in Will's room. He also has a poster of the Aquabats, a celebrated real-world superhero rock band, known best for their costumes and sense of fun. Not only does that put Will's tastes in line with the coolest nerds of the 90s, it works in universe. Perhaps the Aquabats are actually superheroes in the world of Sky High? Beyond this, Will has sketches, a lot of space-themed window stickers and posters, and even a guitar leaning up against the wall behind a weight training bench. At a normal high school, he probably would have actually been cool, with or without superpowers. Layla's pacifist attitude is a common theme throughout the movie. She even refuses to show off her plant-based powers because doing so violates her principles. She thinks a person's power should only be used when the situation demands it. Does she live up to this code? Well, not really. Layla uses her abilities to give her crush an apple and make a flower at a restaurant table wilt. Not exactly high-stakes moments of life and death, so perhaps it's not surprising that she seems to be violating her own principles when she's seen sporting a leather bag. Not many kids notice Layla's bag, or the other inconsistencies in her philosophy, but adults will catch on quickly. Of course, adults also understand that the teenage years are the age at which one learns that principles are complicated. Layla's figuring out her own values and how best to carry them out. Still, someone should probably tell this girl about the wide world of fake leather goods. Does Principal Powers look familiar? Kids look at her and see any other grown-up, but adults will likely notice something familiar in her face. That's because she's played by the one and only Linda Carter, who portrayed the titular heroine of the 1970s Wonder Woman TV series. This reference was actually meant to be more overt, but copyright got in the way. Originally, the plan was for Principal Powers to sport a pair of gold bracelets, referencing Wonder Woman's legendary bullet deflection accessories. Unfortunately, Warner Brothers, the owners of the Wonder Woman copyright, objected. Thus, the bracelets were banished. But as Sky High fans know, this doesn't mean there were no nods to Carter's Amazonian history in the film.
I'm not Wonder Woman, you know.
While kids likely will just consider this a throwaway line, every grown-up in the audience will get a chuckle out of the reference. Additionally, Nurse Specs is played by Cloris Leachman, who played Wonder Woman's mother in the same show. Like any school, Sky High is a learning institution full of teens forming their first political opinions. The nuance of this dynamic most likely escapes kids, but adults catch every single line. Take this exchange in response to the students learning about how they'll be sorted into the school hierarchy.
Power placement?
Sounds fascist.
Layla might be a little dramatic, but she's not wrong. This school runs on the kids on the hero track being separated from those destined for hero support, otherwise known as sidekick status. Speaking of sidekicks, a running joke revolves around the preferred terminology for less powered individuals, which any adult can recognize as reminiscent of many real-world debates.
I believe the preferred term is hero support.
For now.
Then there's the scene where Josie and Steve try to work out their schedules, and Josie mentions a particularly amusing upcoming appointment about a government agency many people find particularly evil.
When are we briefing the president on supervillain infiltration of the IRS?
There is perhaps no joke that flies higher over kids' heads than this one, but their parents get a good chuckle out of it. Figuring out one's taxes can certainly feel like being ensnared in some supervillain scheme. Sky High is jam-packed with puns and allusions to idioms and media that few kids will notice. At most, kids might catch the oxymoron in War and Peace's name, but not know the classic work of literature by Leo Tolstoy it is based on. His name also refers to the conflicting nature of his parentage. His mother is a superhero, and his father is a villain. It's punny as well as thematically resonant. Adults may also catch a sly reference to another well-known Kurt Russell role. After taking a distress call, the commander dramatically informs Jetstream that there is trouble downtown, then repeats himself.
Big trouble. Downtown.
This is a clever nod to 1986's Big Trouble in Little China, which starred Russell as a tough trucker battling an ancient sorcerer. Meanwhile, while Gwen Grayson is the main villain of Sky High, her name contains references to some pretty heroic comic book characters. Gwen Stacy is well known for being Peter Parker's tragic girlfriend, and more recently, as the web-slinging Spider-Gwen. And Dick Grayson was the real name of Batman's sidekick Robin, who eventually became Nightwing. Gwen's role in Sky High can be interpreted as a hybrid of these two characters. Robin, the original sidekick, has often been the butt of cultural jokes. Gwen's vengeance and villainy take root in the fact that she is unappreciated and misunderstood in a similar way. On the flip side, Gwen Stacy began as the ultimate dream girl for Spider-Man fans to idealize, but both she and Sky High's Gwen Grayson are more than they seem. The cast of Sky High is chock full of comedy and sci-fi stars, but one of the most recognizable cameos is also uniquely invisible to most kids. Tom Kenny, the voice of SpongeBob SquarePants, and Jill Talley, the voice of Karen, Plankton's computerized wife, from the iconic Nickelodeon cartoon. The actors, who are married in real life, appear briefly as Mr. and Mrs. Timmerman. Kids won't tie the couple to their animated characters, but adults are a lot likelier to recognize the familiar voice actors. After the Timmermans purchase a home from the Strongholds early in the movie, they move in and comment,
"All unpacked, and the movers didn't break a thing. Told you we didn't need that extra insurance."
Of course, little do they know that they're moments away from a floating school falling out of the sky and smashing their house to smithereens. Fortunately, Will and his friends save their new home, just in the nick of time. If you look closely, the costumes in Sky High play a subtle role in both foreshadowing future events and misleading the audience. For example, Lash's stretchy sleeves are reminiscent of a striped prison uniform, perhaps foreshadowing his eventual reveal as a villainous character. Then there's Gwen Grayson's pink color scheme. The traditionally feminine color stands in stark contrast to the fact that her supervillain persona, Royal Pain, is always assumed to be male. It's also an interesting color choice considering that Gwen's former identity, Sue Tenney, blended into the background as a geek. Her superpowers were poorly understood at the time, resulting in alienation from her classmates. A bold color like bright pink isn't one you'd likely associate with a supervillain, or a mild-mannered wallflower, which makes her reveal as Gwen and her ultimate plan all the more surprising. The soundtrack of Sky High is full of hits only adults will recognize. Tears for Fears' 1985 classic Everybody Wants to Rule the World starts the film off strong. Other hits include Can't Stop the World, released by the Go-Go's in 1981, the Smiths' 1984 song Please, Please, Please Let Me Get What I Want, and Just What I Needed by the Cars, which came out in 1978. This soundtrack represents the many cues Sky High takes from 80s media. Fans of The Breakfast Club, which came out in 1985, will recognize the familiar archetypes recalled by Sky High's characters. Warren mirrors the brooding bad boy John Bender, Magenta calls back to the withdrawn Allison Reynolds, Zach, the goofy geek, reflects the character of Brian Johnson. Claire Standish is the principled Layla, and Will is characterized by the same defining athleticism as Andrew Clark. Just before everything goes sideways, Mr. Boy, the hero support teacher, has the following exchange with Layla at the refreshment table of the homecoming dance.
Hey there, Layla. You look like you could use a drink.
No thanks.
Oh, don't worry, the bubbles are just ginger ale.
He seems to be under the bizarre impression that Layla would think he's blithely offering alcohol to children. Beyond earning a laugh from the adult audience, this moment drives home that Sky High's central teenage characters may be a little more savvy and self-aware than the adults around them. Whether or not these dynamics are actually true in high school is up for debate, but grown-up viewers will likely remember the teenage feeling of thinking that the adults in their lives were oblivious to what was really going on. When All-American Boy comments on the importance of avoiding clashing color schemes between heroes and sidekicks, he's taking a light jab at Batman and Robin's garb. The movie is full of similar references to its various inspirations that only the most comics-savvy members of the audience will get. Sky High derives its story from the long history of superhero comics, and the film is creative enough to craft its own relationship to the canon of the medium. Loving jokes about tropes are just one piece of that puzzle. Sky High pokes particular fun at hero and villain origin stories, especially the difference in experience between those who are radioactively transformed and those who inherit powers from their parents. There's even a joke at the end that ties up the story of Ron Wilson, the bus driver, and a charmingly goofy jab at chemical-induced superpowers.
Oh yeah, and Ron Wilson, bus driver, fell into a vat of toxic waste. He now works for the mayor defending the city from giant robots.
Toxic waste has been a key element in the origin stories of iconic characters, ranging from the Joker to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So it's only fitting that Sky High would work in a nod to this bizarre method of gaining superpowers. Wilson is an unlikely superhero, and that's the point. These superpowered stories are silly and unrealistic, and that's why we love them. After her evil plan is foiled by Will and his friends, Gwen grumbles in detention.
I went through puberty twice for this.
Younger children might hear this line and ask their parents, "What's puberty?" It sounds bad. It may set parents up for a somewhat awkward conversation, but it will also give them a chuckle, since adults will recall all too well the discomfort and awkwardness of puberty. Then again, as the movie's last line states,
But hey, that's high school.
sure, puberty sucks, but you can also develop your own sense of style during it, find a group of friends, and learn to balance the desire to belong with the desire to be true to yourself. Most importantly, though, you learn that there is no going back to childhood, regardless of what Sky High says, and you're on a one-way flying bus ride to adulthood. But somehow, we all get through it, just like Will does. Kids might not get the humor of this line, but the movie is helping prepare them for the age at which it'll eventually click.
Viewing the Flintstones through adult eyes reveals a complex world with a lot of dark or problematic moments. You wouldn't notice them if you're a kid, but if you're a grown-up, you yabba-dabba-doo. While the Flintstones is clearly a riff on the groundbreaking sitcom The Honeymooners, it does make a few notable changes. The Flintstones is a bit more of an equal opportunity offender when it comes to domestic abuse. Ralph Cramden threatened to beat his wife so often that his verbal promise of violence became a TV catchphrase.
Bang, zoom!
Audiences never actually saw Ralph get physical with his wife, but viewers of the Flintstones saw it work the other way around. Fred often threatened Wilma, but that's where it stopped. However, when Fred did something Wilma didn't like, which was often, she'd clock him on the head, drop heavy objects on his feet, fling him across the room, and who knows what else.
Wilma, no, not in the head!
That on your
Of course, Fred wasn't the easiest caveman to live with. He had serious anger management issues, he constantly twisted the truth, and his views on the role of women in society really did belong in the Stone Age.
How many times have I told you a woman's place is in the home?
For a show that took place millions of years ago, The Flintstones is surprisingly progressive about a number of issues. In the 1960s, it was revolutionary that the series was open about how Barney and Betty Rubble couldn't naturally conceive a child like the Flintstones and how upset they were about it. It was a major TV event in February 1963 when Wilma gave birth to Pebbles, and afterwards, the Rubbles spent an inordinate amount of time hanging out with the new arrival. They just want a baby so bad. As a last resort, they make a wish on a falling star. The next morning, their wish has apparently been granted, and they find a baby boy at their doorstep, a supernaturally strong orphan named Bam Bam.
Whee! Oh, Barney, we've got our very own baby!
However, the couple still had a long way to go before they could call Bam Bam their own. Adult viewers will certainly feel some empathy as the Rubbles jump through legal hoops to adopt the little powerhouse and are only granted custody at the last minute. The whole ordeal mentally drains Barney to the point where he wants to take his own life.
Goodbye, cruel world.
Luckily, Fred shows up just in time to save the day and Bam Bam's new daddy. The Flintstones wouldn't be the Flintstones without animals, birds, and other creatures performing all kinds of household and mechanical tasks. The modern Stone Age family seems to have an animal for every job. A mastodon instead of a shower, a monkey-bird tag team inside a record player, a swordfish for a kitchen knife, and an artistic bird that functions as a prehistoric Polaroid camera, just to name a few. You have to wonder what these animals actually think of Fred.
The guy's a pig, a Neanderthal.
You're dead to me, can opener!
It doesn't seem like the animals on the Flintstones are getting paid or have any freedom whatsoever. In other words, the humans of the Flintstones have enslaved animals, forcing all creatures great and small into being beasts of burden. While this is cruel, some animals have it worse than others. Birds' tails are constantly being yanked. A pelican serves as a trash can, meaning people force-feed it garbage. And possibly worst of all, a variety of poor creatures are forced to sacrifice their entire lives for construction and mining.
I've had just about enough of these lazy f***s using us as slave labor.
The uprising is upon us!
Like most sitcoms of the 1960s, The Flintstones was not serialized. Each episode completely stood on its own, with Fred, Wilma, Barney, and Betty getting into some kind of hairy situation and resolving it by the end of the episode. Kids can accept this. They can enjoy shows on a surface level. Adults may want to know more about developments in the Flintstones universe, such as what happens after the events in the episode Dino and Juliet. In this comic version of Romeo and Juliet, Fred Flintstone and a new neighbor get into a heated dispute. Instead of the warring factions' teenage offspring falling in love, their pet dinosaurs do. Dino falls instantly head over heels for Juliet, the cute new sauropod in town.
Well, if that don't beat the bush, Dino's in love!
As lovers are wont to do, Dino and Juliet steal away for some privacy, which results in the birth of more than a dozen babies. Never again on the Flintstones are Juliet or her children with Dino seen. Apparently, he's an absentee father and the love him and leave him type. After a few years on the air, sitcoms tend to bring in a new character to breathe fresh life into the series. Homeless teen Luke showed up on Growing Pains, Cousin Oliver appeared on The Brady Bunch, and The Simpsons mocked the entire concept with a random character named Roy.
Adding a new character is often a desperate attempt to boost low ratings.
Yo, how's it hanging, everybody?
Morning, Roy.
The Flintstones pioneered this move back in 1965 with the arrival of a tiny, smug alien named the Great Gazoo. The little green ET had been sent through space and time to prehistoric Earth as punishment for making a doomsday device on his home planet. Gazoo has clearly seen his share of dark places.
Get off me, you big llama! Gazoo, where have you been?
Fred and Barney discover him, and rather than report him to the government, they befriend him, although Gazoo mainly seems to call them dum-dums and magically disappear whenever Fred is talking to him, which gives the impression that Fred has mental issues. Or maybe the Great Gazoo isn't real at all, and Fred and Barney have been ingesting some unknown substances with mysterious side effects. Yes, The Flintstones is a cartoon, and it passed strict network standards in the conservative early 1960s, but somehow it managed to sneak in the occasional dirty joke for the adults in the room. In one episode, Fred and Barney are watching TV when they lose reception. Fred asks if everything is in working order, and Barney immediately hits Fred with a comeback that would make most parents blush in front of their kids.
How's your antenna? Fine, Fred, how's yours?
It would also seem they had adult films way back in the Stone Age. While Fred's getting a checkup, a doctor holds up Fred's X-ray, prompting Flintstone to joke, "How about it, Doc? Flintstone in an X-rated picture." While these man cave jokes were right up Fred and Barney's alley, we can't help but wonder how Wilma and Betty would react.
Burn!